So I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics and technology and towards an appreciation of ethics values and the value of ethics in TVN. So what is TVN? Well, I'm just kind of going back, just reminding us where we started this morning when John gave his little introduction. It's technology evaluation in the elderly. And the mission statement says, our mission is to improve the care of seriously ill, frail elderly patients and their families through the development, rigorous evaluation, and ethical implementation of healthcare technologies, including drugs, devices, knowledge products, improvement strategies, and tools. And the last part basically says we've got a fairly expansive view of technologies. We're not talking just about this next slide. We're not just talking about hard technologies here like ICDs and respirators and pharmaceuticals, but we're talking about soft technologies as well, which are much more like techniques, like advanced directives, for example, visitation policies in long-term care, mandatory vaccination policy for healthcare workers. Those are soft technologies or techniques that we use to organize people, to dictate behaviors, to try to manage the healthcare environment in one way or another. And TVN is about all of those things and much, much more. And the kinds of things we heard about today, sort of extending technology out of the hospital into the community, connecting all the electronic health records, giving access to them through patients and so forth. All interesting, exciting, but all of them have interesting ethical implications. And that's what my little talk is about this afternoon. So here are some recent ethics consultations that I've been involved in just over the last couple of months. Part of my job is I'm a clinical ethics consultant. So in addition to teaching and researching, I spend about a day of my week doing clinical ethics. So a recent case is with a disputed DNR, a 79-year-old woman with dementia, on dialysis, lots of other comorbidities. I'm in St. John's, Newfoundland is where I work, and St. John's has the only really tertiary care hospital in the province, so we have to, any complex need patient generally gets transferred into St. John's. So this person was from outside, and largely because of her dialysis and her other complex needs, she ended up in the ICU at our hospital. But she stabilized. They want to transfer out of the ICU onto the medical ward. Hopefully, maybe get her back to her community, but there's some question about whether that'll ever happen because of her dialysis problems and so forth. But the people in the ICU say this is really not the place for her. She's been in and out of the ICU a couple of times. She's not going to get better. In fact, she's really in the palliative care mode. But the family is completely against. They want everything done. To do anything other than everything would be murder, is what one of the family members said. So there's a ongoing discussion about a unilateral DNR that the people in the ICU have said, we're just not going to take her back. When she gets transferred out, and if she deteriorates, she's just not supposed to. We're not a palliative care unit. We're not going to be bringing her back. Meanwhile, the renal people say, well, if she fails out here, we're going to do a code on her because, as one person said, we just don't have the stomach to deal with the legal stuff that's been happening across it. So that's one area where technologies, wonderful as they are, push us to these kinds of things. And notice this is a family making demands. We heard a lot about consumers and consumer input and so forth. That's great. This is the flip side of consumer input, is kind of, we're going to make demands. We're going to demand how the healthcare system, you are our servants, and we're going to make those demands. Another recent case, and we get probably about one of these a month. We have a committee which I'm often invited to sit on, called the Rapid Response Committee. It usually has to do with off-label drugs, usually an oncology treatment where a cancer patient has failed every other available drug, and it's kind of a last hope medication, but it's not on the formulary. It's not being funded at this point by the provincial health program, but the oncologist comes and says, there's this drug, it's available, I think it might work. The evidence, although it's not complete yet, it's still being looked at by Health Canada, and CADF is evaluating it and so forth. But hey, it's the only thing that's left. Can I get permission to give it to her? But the cost is going to be $100,000 for the number of rounds of treatment we're going to get, and we're looking at maybe we could extend her life by 6 months. And those are very real cases. They're real patients. And the physicians are in there advocating for their patient, but our committee has to decide, can we afford $100,000? Because this is a zero-sum game. There's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser in this respect. So we have to make those kinds of decisions. That, again, technology, access to technology, physicians doing what they should do, advocating for their patients, but having to make those very important decisions because we're talking about somebody's life, but we're also talking about other people's lives. And this is the third case, is long-term care. There's an ethics consultation asked not about any particular patient, but our OTs, occupational therapists and physiotherapists, had asked for a consultation because of an ongoing problem they have. When patients get admitted into long-term care, they're assessed by OTs and PTs, and they're either stage 1 through 4. The only person who's going to get any OT or PT help is stage 1. If you're stage 2, even though you're high up on the priority list, there just aren't enough people around, enough OTs and PTs to provide the basic kind of things that they need to do to keep you functional. And if you're 3 and 4, don't even, you're not going to get any help. Even though you may just need to have a little bit of help to get out of bed, to get with the walker and so forth, people stay in their beds. There's just nobody there to do this for them. And there's nobody trained, and families aren't trained, don't have the adequate training to help their family member out of bed and so forth. And what happens is people who are 3 and 4 stage, they deteriorate to 2. They get other comorbidities. They end up back in the acute care hospital, and it's a vicious circle. And when we're talking $100,000 for one patient for a drug to extend her life by 6 months, and we're thinking about what will it cost us to hire an OT and to have her on the floor, her or him on the floor, it's a kind of ethical quandary, but often these problems are addressed in isolation. I happen to see them because I move across the healthcare system, but our oncologists, they're not thinking about long-term care. I mean, that's not what they do. And our ICU people, they're not thinking about long-term care generally and what the costs are there and so forth. We have a kind of siloed healthcare system that everybody's trying to do the right thing, but we're often working at cross purposes in these kinds of things. So just a little bit of an example of the kinds of, and all of these are technology-related issues, where the technologies, wonderful as they are, and as positive as they are in so many respects, create other kinds of conundrums for us along the way, all with ethical implications. So how do we start with technology analysis? So this is my place where I give you the history of the Western world in about a minute. All right? So this is my GST lecture, I call it. For those of you who can remember the old GST, it's God, Science, and Technology. And so I divide the history of the Western world up into 3 broad swaths. There was the God era, the science era, and the technology era. And the God era, and it's not that there was no science and technology in the God era. It's just that this was the predominant way that people interacted with their world. And the God era went from the beginning of time until sometime around the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and so forth, where we didn't understand much about nature. We were learning and so forth, but we couldn't control it. And it was largely, it's in God's hands. We leave things in God's hands. We might pray, we might offer sacrifices to the gods and so forth, but we as human beings were largely passive in the face of nature at that point. Well, once the Enlightenment came along and we entered into the science era, we went from supernatural selection, we went to natural selection now. Now nature takes its course, but still we were relatively, we weren't much more able to control nature up until the Industrial Revolution than we had been previous to that. Now I'm making broad generalizations and overstatements, but just to sort of make a point, we were largely, as human beings, still largely passive in the face of nature. But after the Industrial Revolution, on through the 20th century, up to where we are today, we've really entered into the technological era. And now we've got the technologies, the ability to control nature in a certain sense. And it's not that God still isn't invoked and that we're not relying on science, but really it's technology that dictates the course of many of our actions. And we've moved away from natural selection to unnatural selection, and which means that it's not that we're humanly passive in the face of all this anymore. Now we take on human responsibility for the kinds of unnatural choices that we make when nature would have taken its course, but we intervene and do something differently. So that spawned this whole area of work and research now called health technology assessment, and that's really what one arm of TVN is all about, is assessing the technologies that we're introducing. So health technology assessment is a systematic evaluation of the properties and effects of a health technology, addressing the direct and intended effects of this technology, as well as its indirect and unintended consequences, and aimed mainly at informed decision-making and so forth. So we look at technologies, we have a sense of the positive things that they can do, but it's often more difficult to take that broader view and say, but what are the unintended consequences? What are the things that are that might come along in the wake of technology that we hadn't anticipated, and how might that change the nature of our human relationships, the nature of our responsibilities to one another, and so forth. So you should never put a philosopher up right after lunch because you've got your full stomach and so forth. But so this is a chance to get you thinking. So technology evaluation. Think about technologies. Are technologies value neutral? That is, it's just a hammer is just a hammer. There's no particular values. If it might be valuable to you if you're a carpenter, but the hammer in and of itself isn't imbued with any values per se, even though we say give a boy a hammer and the whole world looks like a nail. That has more to do with boys than with hammers, I think. But what do you think? Are technologies value neutral? How many think technology is basically value neutral? It's how we use them that is imbued with value. Is that? How many think that technologies actually do have values sort of right into their core? So we got those who are willing to vote. Here's a famous example. This is sort of what the NRA and the States, the National Riflemen's Association, they say guns don't kill people, people do. A gun is just a technology, doesn't have any values, but of course we know that people with guns kill a lot more people than people without guns. So how is that interface between people and technology, and what are the values involved in that? So let's think about technology. All of us we're completely immersed in a technological environment. I used to teach a course called Society, Technology, and Values, and used to say that if you take a frog and put it into a beaker of lukewarm water and just heat it up on a Bunsen burner, a degree at a time, you can boil the frog before the frog even realizes that its environment is getting hot, because it's a cold-blooded animal and it's not aware of this incremental change. And in some respects, we live in a technological environment that could be having that same kind of effect on us. We're so immersed in it, we're not aware of how it's affecting us and so forth. And part of what this process is to sort of see if we can step out of the beaker and think about what we're doing for a bit. So there are at least two different views of technology. And one is this view that technology is the means by which we adapt nature to human ends. From an evolutionary perspective, we've adapted to our environment continually, but now we as human beings have reached a point in our own evolutionary history that we no longer, because of our ability to control our environment, we no longer are going to evolve into some higher life form, because we are a higher life form already who can develop technologies to manipulate our environment and control our environment. So that's one view of technology. That's the unnatural selection kind of thing, that technology are our means of controlling the environment that we live in. But there's another view of technology, and it goes back to at least to Jacques Ellul, who's a French philosopher who wrote back in the 1950s. He wrote a book called The Technological Society, and Ellul developed an idea he called autonomous technology. He says technologies are really part of the environment, and we don't actually control technologies, but technologies control us. And from one of the talks this morning, I stuck this in there. Consider the planet has developed a central nervous system. That kind of language that, this intranet of nets, network of networks, or whatever the term was that the gentleman used this morning. The idea that, the planet has developed a central nervous system. It's got a life of its own, a technological world. Well, Ellul anticipated this already back in the 1950s, and he actually said, just as there are natural laws that govern the natural world, there are technological laws that govern the technological world. And we may think that we control our technologies, but our technologies actually control us. And we even saw it a little bit. John made the comment this morning. He says, yeah, technology talk. And of course, we have a breakdown in technology. I mean, if the power went out right now, end of story for us. We're gone, We're completely dependent on these technologies. If the planes stop, if the roads get blocked, we're completely dependent on technologies, and they control us completely. And the same in healthcare. Do we control the technologies, or the technologies that we're developing, are they actually dictating to us how we're going to practice healthcare? And when we think about the wonderful kinds of opportunities and innovative ways that technologies are being introduced in terms of long-term care and the kinds of things we heard this morning, those are great, but are they actually increasing our autonomy as individuals, or are they decreasing it and shaping us in a way so that we have to adapt to that technological environment rather than actually using the technology to adapt the environment to what our human needs are? Are there technological needs that dictate things that we as human beings simply are following suit? Ellul kind of took that view. Well, take a couple of examples. Now, I'm probably one of the older ones in the room. It's hard to say that. I never used to have, I always thought I was the young guy. But, I can remember, and maybe some of you can too if you're over 45 or so, there used to be things called phone booths. They were really, really phenomenal things. If you wanted to make a phone call, a personal phone call to somebody, you went in there and you closed the door so you could have some privacy. Isn't that weird? Now I go into an airport and I say, could we have some privacy, please? I don't want to listen to your conversation, your fight with your girlfriend, or your discussion with your stockbroker, or whatever else that's going on. And many people walk around, we used to think they were schizophrenic, but now they're just walking out back and forth, talking to themselves and gesticulating and so forth. In less than a generation, we've had a cultural transformation in terms of a certain way that we interact with each other that's been dictated largely by a technology that every one of us simply couldn't see ourselves without anymore. We won't leave home without it. But is it because that's going to increase our ability to control our world, or is it now demanded? I mean, my daughter still gets angry with me because if she texts me, I am supposed to text back right away. And then sometimes I do text her and she says, Dad, I sent that 3 days ago. I don't even remember what that message was about. I simply haven't adapted yet. In fact, they say in transformative technologies, a technology that really transforms society, it takes about 40 years for society to adapt, because technology and science generally move much faster than social institutions in adapting. But when you think about 40 years, it means that old people like me, we never actually adapt. We just die off. That's what technology adaptation is. It's that the old people die off, the next generation, they're all up to speed on it and so forth. So that's one example. Here's another example, a stethoscope. This is, when I'm teaching medical students, I teach together with a group of wonderful physicians that teach the clinical skills course, that are teaching first-year medical students, basic interviewing skills and so forth. And so the first 6 or 8 weeks of medical school for these new students in the clinical skills course is largely about how to take a patient history, how to talk to a patient. They haven't got any instruments yet. They're just, communication is so key. But one of the physicians I worked with, she says, around about the beginning of November, because they order all their stethoscopes and their other kinds of scopes and all these wonderful things that I can't even pronounce, they order all of those because that's what real doctors do, right? You use technology. This interviewing stuff, I can interview. That doesn't make me special, but if you're a medical doctor, then you get a stethoscope and you get to wear it around your neck as you walk around the hospital, and medical students love to do that because it's like a badge of honor. But this one physician I was working with, she says, we teach them all these wonderful interviewing skills, and they're really good at it, and we think they're getting it, and then they get their stethoscopes. And she says the stethoscope's an amazing instrument. It increases the user's ability to hear while decreasing his or her ability to listen. Because they don't want to listen to patients anymore. They don't talk to me. I want to do what real doctors do. I'm not quite sure what I'm hearing here, but I want to listen. Again, I'm overstating things. But it's an indication of how technologies alter our perception. So technologies are like magnifying glasses. A magnifying glass is a very useful piece of technology, but it focuses our attention on a particular thing, and in the case of technology evaluation, particular values, often at the expense of other values that we simply don't pay attention to because the technology forces us to look at things in a particular way. So here's a model of technological efficiency. I know John, when he made his introductory comments this morning, he talked about efficiency as one of the things that we're on about at TVN. And he said value for money, I think, is the way we put it. And we often do think of something as efficient if on some kind of economic scale we can say we got more value for money for it, then it's a more efficient technology will give us more value for money. But Albert Borgman, who's a philosopher that wrote back in the 1980s, when I was a graduate student actually, Borgman's book came out, and he wrote a book called The Technology and the Value of Contemporary Life. And he had developed something he called the device paradigm, and he said efficiency really isn't a value in and of itself. Efficiency is a meta-value, what philosophers talk that way, and they say something is efficient in achieving whatever goal you want to have. So if your goal is to save money, then an efficient technology saves money. But if your goal is a communication, then you might be able to save a whole bunch of money with a particular technology, but really reduce communication. And so he says, but technology is kind of going to that or magnifying glass kind of thing. He says technologies tend to focus our attention on a particular kind of value, and he says it's really a commodification process. Technologies produce commodities, and then we measure the efficiency of our technology by whether it produces that commodity instantly, everywhere we would want it to be, safely and easily. So that would be a much more efficient technology. So a cell phone or a smartphone is a much more efficient technology in that respect than your landline, because you can carry your cell phone everywhere and you can make calls instantaneously and so on and so forth. But so we generally measure technologies that way, and these wonderful technologies we heard about this morning, in many respects, that's how they would measure their efficiency. If they could do what they wanted to do easily, we want to have good interfaces with the consumer. It's got to be safe. Ideally, you can do it anywhere. You can be walking along, pick up your smartphone. You've got an app on it. You can talk to mom in the long-term care facility. That's great, instantaneously. And so that's an efficient technology. But Borgman says, well, let's just hold the phone for a minute. And he uses an example, a non-medical example. He says, think about a wood stove. The commodity a wood stove is supposed to produce is heat. Because when you think about a wood stove, is what it does, it produces heat. But is it an efficient technology using these four criteria? Well, not really. I have a wood stove at home, and I tell you, when I want heat from my wood stove, it doesn't come instantaneously. It only heats the one room in the house. Well, we've got kind of an open concept, so it goes upstairs and heats the bedrooms upstairs as well. But often wood stoves only can heat a smaller area. It's relatively safe as long as I don't chop my thumb off with the axe when I'm cutting wood. And it's not easy because there's lots of things to do, but wood stoves burn down houses and so forth. So on this kind of metric, a wood stove is not really an efficient technology for producing heat. Central heating, on the other hand, you can go into any room, flick a switch, heats almost instantaneously, the whole house is warmed evenly and so forth. So on this model of efficiency, central heating is just way more efficient than a wood stove. But then Borgman says, but think about other kinds of values that a wood stove might have. In a house that really depended on a wood stove for heat, somebody would have to develop the skill of using an axe. Somebody would have the social responsibility to make sure that the wood is in, and develop the skill of actually building a fire and so forth, things that most of us don't do, wouldn't want to be bothered with anymore. I actually like it myself. But those are and on cold winter nights, when the rest of the house is cold because there's no heat to them, the whole family has to stay in the room where the heat is so that there's a social interaction. Now, that's kind of a romantic view. They might fight each other and tear each other's eyes out, but everybody doesn't run off into their own room to do their own thing themselves, because this technology isn't just about heat. It's about a whole bunch of social interactions, and that's what Borgman wants us to think about in terms of technologies. So, and we have to think about the technologies that we're talking about across the board in TVN. What does the technology force us to focus on, and what is it that we might be missing on the way through? In some of my thinking about technology and work and so forth, I developed what I call the technology relational continuum. Because the more technologies push themselves to the forefront, the less emphasis we have on relationships oftentimes. And this is largely based on my own experience doing clinical ethics. When I started off doing clinical ethics, I very fortunately worked with people largely in palliative care. And a wonderful place to work with people because, number one, the death issue has more or less taken care of itself. We've more or less come to the conclusion that this person is in the latter stages of life and we're providing the kind of support we want. They still use technologies and so forth, but there's lots about relational kinds of things. And I used to give talks about end-of-life decision-making to people in the palliative care unit. I was asked to come to give a talk to a bunch of ICU nurses one time. And I went in there and I had my sort of stock cases that I'd put up there, and I'd flash one up on the board, and one of the nurses, she'd say, "This is the problem, these are the options, this is the best one, what's the next problem?" And I mean, she was like a machine, And at first I thought, wow, these ICU nurses, they're so uncaring and insensitive, But then I was asked to come to a long-term care facility this is out in rural Ontario, actually, at the time. And it was a long-term care facility that, for the first time, they'd had a patient there who'd been a resident there for a number of years. Everybody knew this man, loved him. He had a stroke, went into the hospital, they stabilized him and so forth, and they basically sent him back and told the long-term care people, he's palliative, just provide comfort measures. He's really at the latter stage, but they'd never had to deal with one of these things before. So I was asked to come out and do an ethics consultation with them. So I went out there, I thought, well, I'll give them my sort of standard. Well, I spent about 2 hours with these people, and I got an education from them, because they didn't think of George here as just a patient. He was a resident. He was there. All of them had spent lots of time with George. They had this relationship with him. And I realized that, the ICU nurses weren't uncaring. It's just that an ICU is a technologically rich environment. You're not going to sit down and hold somebody's hand generally, because the situation requires that you respond in certain kinds of ways and so forth. And the technology dictates so much of what you're going to do and so forth. And ICU people are highly skilled, highly trained, and excellent at what they do. But they don't have the time, the opportunity, and so forth to develop a lot of those kinds of broader relational kinds of things and so forth. What was interesting as I was listening this morning, and we heard a lot about these technologies, it seemed to me, and people that work in sort of social determinants of health and so forth, they often get concerned about what they call the medicalization of healthcare. The biomedical model that says that, well, health issues are largely what we can measure biologically and so forth. Those are the kinds of things that we need physicians and medical experts to do. But the broader determinants of health often get pushed to the side. I'm going to be finished here in a minute, John. And it occurred to me as I was listening to this, I thought, what's happening with many of these wonderful technologies that we're hearing about is that it's kind of like we're moving the medicalization from the ICU back out to the community now, because we have quicker and sicker discharges from hospitals all the time. We've got sicker people in their homes. So we have to find some way of moving the medical technology out to the home, and many of the wonderful kinds of technologies that are being developed and offered to us here as potential ways of dealing with this morning, they're doing that kind of thing. But we have to start thinking, well, the more we medicalize these issues, are we pushing out other kinds of relational things? I mean, if the daughter can pick up her she's got her app and she can figure out that, what was mom eating today? Did she have a bowel movement and so forth? And yeah, I can talk to her for a couple of minutes, but I'm really busy, but I got to talk to mom for 2 minutes. So check that off. I'm busy, I'm going to do something else. Those are potential things that might happen. I'm just guessing here, but it can change the nature of the human relationships that we have, and those are things that we have to think about. So, my conclusion. Technologies are an essential feature of modern healthcare, but by their very nature, they select for certain values while pushing others to the periphery. And technological efficiency may not always equate with human relational efficiency. So those are some general comments on these kinds of things. Thank you.